Hello?
Yo, hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks. So yeah, thanks for accepting the debate. So basically, just ran across some of your videos, and I like, some of the analysis that you've done on China, but I think you're just missing a few key points. So just sort of wanted to debate that. Yeah.
Okay.
I've watched some of your videos, and a lot of your debates seem to be sort of like unorganized. So I kind of got 3 points that I sort of wanted to touch on. So I kind of want to summarize that, and then maybe we could go through each of them.
Sure.
All right. So one I have, I say China is flourishing because I think China is a technocracy, and not necessarily because they're Marxist-Leninists. That's my first point. Two would be that I think America can sort of adopt this technocratic approach more and sort of do better than where America currently stands. And then three, why I don't think Chinese polarity is good. Sort of is going to encompass the first 2 points. So yeah, those are my 3 points. So I guess, do you want to get started with one? My first point on why I think China is flourishing, and it's because it's a technocracy. So I think China really uses their technologies well. Of course, their central government has a lot of control over all of their businesses and all of their tech businesses specifically, and I think they're able to sort of gather that data with no restraint, like maybe in the U.S., and really able to use that information to sort of control their population. And so I think that's sort of one of the reasons why they're more efficient. And I don't necessarily think that even if they weren't Marxist Leninists, I think they could still you would still see growth similar to what we've seen.
So the first question I have to ask is: are there examples of technocracies in history that are not Marxist-Leninist?
I would say no, not really. I could kind of see South Korea, and maybe not the strongest example. I would say, to be honest, China is the strongest example of a technocracy. Um, but I don't necessarily think that being Marxist Leninist, like I could see America being a technocracy in its own way, or like other developed countries. It doesn't necessarily have to be just Marxist Leninist countries.
So can you please, what do you mean by a technocracy? What does that mean?
Oh, and someone in the chat says Singapore. That's not a terrible example, but
Don't worry
um,
about chat. But
okay,
what
okay.
what to you is an example of a technocracy?
Yeah, basically, so the elite, the ruling class, basically being cultivated based on technical skills and engineering skills rather than some sort of other criteria like political affiliation or whatnot. So just really like engineers and technical people really moving up the ladder into the ruling class.
Okay. And so why is it that you think in China specifically, as opposed to the rest of the world, there's a cultivation of engineers as opposed to like political ideologists or lawyers, as in the case of the U.S., that climb the ladders?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily think that China explicitly went out to do this. I think I guess in a way they did. There's a book out there. I can't recall. Yeah, there's a book out there that I recently read that sort of touches on China and it being a technocracy. But basically, the summary of the book basically is that there's some Confucius philosophy that sort of states that it likes to that the ruling class basically should be based on skill and technical just skill and just intelligence in general, right? So I think sort of some of their Confucian and other more religious philosophies have sort of naturally, combined with, their Marxist-Leninist views, and sort of it happens to be that, they it sort of happened to be like the perfect storm. But I don't necessarily think them being Marxist-Leninist exclusively is the reason why that they've sort of adopted this technocratic approach. Like I said, I think the U.S. is an example, South Korea, other examples, Singapore, Japan. I think those countries can also take a more of a technocratic approach as well.
Right, but those countries are not what I would call I'm inventing this word multi. They don't have an ability to deal with the multi-cyclical um, booms and busts of their economy. When they have long-term trends of decline and stagnation, they don't have the ability, as in the case of China, to reinvigorate their economy and offset these kind of falling rates of profit. So it seems to me that in the case of South Korea and Japan and those countries, when there is an economic miracle, it's a it lasts temporarily, and then when there's a decline, the decline seems to be long term.
Right. Yeah, but I think it's because the financial institutions are really what controls like more of the liberal countries, right? But we've never had a real society. Well, again, maybe except China, where the technocrats or the engineer types are the ones that are actually engineering the economy. It's the financial class that does that in liberal countries. But my argument would be that if there was more engineer types, they would kind of foresee the debt cycles and
The-
address them accordingly.
right, but you know what the problem with having a so-called technocracy is that there's a great deal of politics and legitimacy in statehood that is non-technical. That's based in something kind of spiritual, right? It's the connection between the people and the state. And it's also the overall intentions of the state in the first place. What does the state actually want to do um, in a non-technical sense? Like here, you can't explain this technically because the intention is human. Like, is your goal to maximize the welfare of your people and advance your economy? Well, then how do you go about giving purpose and meaning and explanation to that in a non-technical sense? So while China is ruled by engineers in terms of the people who are carrying out the policies, the ones who are actually responsible for the overall orientations in the Chinese economy are um, ideologists, right? Spiritual ideologists who draw from this kind of populist legitimacy from the Chinese people. So there's a balance in China between the kind of technocratic engineers who are just, getting things done and making sure it works. And on the other hand, the kind of more spiritual or even moral guidance provided by the party leadership.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I agree.
without the party leadership, I would argue that China's technocracy, if you're going to call it that, would not work.
Well, I know you're explaining how China is, but I sort of think that ideology portion is sort of limiting them. To be honest, I think if they went full technocratic and sort of, obviously this is not going to happen because they are Marxist-Leninists, I guess, ideologically. But if they somehow were able to get rid of it, I think they would grow even more.
So
Because as you
in what ways is the ideology impeding China's development?
Well, I think political ideologies in general impede,
Okay.
the more science, the more
Well,
science
what are
approach.
specific examples in China?
I mean, if at the expense, if the Chinese people saw that, tech companies, for example, were sort of violating the rule, violating some sort of human rights with its people, they might step in and sort of stop any sort of progress that goes on. Whatever example that is, you probably have seen examples of that. Like, let's say, like limiting video gaming or something, if for a certain age range, like that could technically hurt. And not, this is not the greatest example, but something like that would technically interfere with the revenues of these tech companies. And if it was if that example was sort of you know another, it's not the greatest example, but that's an example of one where the
So
Chinese government saw that as like a negative to the people, and so they sort of stopped it.
so um if well, to me that's the paradox of technocracy, right? Because technocracy cannot account for the purpose of the rule of the technical engineers. For what See, a technic, right? I don't want to get too much into like derailing, but
Yeah.
technic is based on what? It's based on technique. The word technology comes from the Greek techne, right? Which means to be able to reproduce or replicate some kind of form, right? So this is something that is subordinate, though, to the logos, right? Which is the overall purpose and the overall reason for the technique, right? That gives it actual purpose. So I cannot see how a technocracy can ground its own rationality. For what reason are we uh, engaging in this technology? What is the reason for it?
Well, I guess the purpose would just be to run the economy or run the country as efficiently as possible. I guess that would be the end goal, and that's
So,
sort
what
of
does
why.
efficiency mean exactly?
So just profitability for the country, overall country. I guess some countries, most countries measured in GDP. There's obviously other metrics like purchasing power and whatnot for citizens, but basically the country initially extracting as much resources as possible. Uh,
Okay, I can give you an example though of how that might be a problem for the country, and
okay.
actually that it's paradoxical. It's actually the same reason why capitalism has internal contradictions. So there are periods of Chinese policymaking where they have to implement policies that actually harm profitability, right? That put the country in debt to build infrastructure and so on. And meanwhile, the accumulation of super profits, um, profitability itself does not address the actual human needs and human wants and longings of the population itself. If profitability is going to be measured formally, right? If we measure profit, for example, in terms of money or in terms of some kind of numbers, then this will actually inevitably come into contradiction with the actual profitability of wealth in general, of actually producing things. So sometimes, in order to have more things, this has to come at the expense of the way in which you measure wealth, right? So to have more wealth, you often have to implement policies that come at the expense of profitability in the symbols of wealth, which is money.
Yeah, I
And that's
mean that's
something the
true.
Chinese government is well aware of.
Yeah, I mean that is true, but for example, like, tech companies in the US, for example, they build infrastructure, right? You can make an argument that they probably could build infrastructure right now better than the US government could. So I don't necessarily think that uh, you know, infrastructure wouldn't be built um, if engineers ran the country. I think they would see that, as you mentioned, they would see that there would need to be strong infrastructure for.
Right, but the problem is that private companies will not take on the immense risks of accumulating so much debt like the government will.
Yeah, well, of course, this is hypothetically if those engineers were running the country, not as it currently stands in the U.S. or the West in general. But if
Right.
if the, yeah, if the engineers were running the country, I guess they would be able to use the state's capital to go into debt. Like country, government or like businesses already go into debt for things.
But you
And
see what the problem was that I described before, which is that if we have a technocracy, right, then the goal is to very impartially, without any sentiment or whatever, as you put it, any political ideology impeding it or any human rights. The goal is merely to increase efficiency, right? To maximize the overall wealth of the economy. And then what the people decide to do with that wealth, who cares, right? We're at least getting things done, right? The problem, though, is that if it is truly if it's technocrats who are responsible for this increase in efficiency, as technologists, their only manner by which they're going to be able to measure efficiency is somehow formally, right? For example, through numbers, like GDP and so on and so on. When and this can inevitably become something removed from the actual production of wealth, and I don't see how a technocracy can solve this problem. Only if you have a more overarching goal of increasing the welfare of the people, which is very much not something that can be easily formally defined, right? I mean, what does it mean to increase the welfare of the people? Well, it means to look out for their well being. It means to also increase their wealth and overall human flourishing. But that also means, you know, um,
isn't that implicit in every country anyway?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Well, I think it is. I think every person would want what you just described, and I think everyone sort of believes that. Maybe the
Right,
way they go about it is
right. But
different.
The problem is that in formal democracies, right? The way in which that is implemented is through, like, for example, the formal electoral process, and then that's how people give expression to what they want, and then the politicians that they elect will in turn do the things that the people want, and everything's fine. But we're confronted with this paradox that the people that they're voting for are not in fact doing what they want, and people are dissatisfied. Things are not getting done, and the stated intention of a society that increases liberty and prosperity for all, or whatever, right, is not being realized, right? So
Yeah, I
they
think part
may,
of that though is this just an efficient way of governing and like even tallying votes, right? Like we don't even like it's not even electronic in a lot of sense. Like a lot of it is still handwritten and it's just not effective. I think you could have a vote the way we sort of do with representative democracy and still be more effective and just take like surveys and votes directly through electronically
I
rather
don't think
than
that's possible, because when it comes to a more fundamental question of sovereignty, that is not something that people can vote for. In this sense, people do not know what they really want, right? When it comes to the overall sovereign,
yeah, so someone would obviously be giving them choices, right, to choose from. It's not going to be just a blank slate of, hey,
right?
just
But
write
the
whatever
the
you want.
issue with Western democracies is that these elections tend to be like existential choices about the overall nature and character of the state, especially in the United States today. Like, for example, in an election between Trump and Biden. Um, so it's this whole sovereignty of the state, the whole purpose of the state's existence is being imperiled through some kind of formal mechanism that is itself conditioned by the state. So this leads to all manner of paradoxes. Trump
Yeah,
calls
but
the
I mean,
election
I see.
illegitimate,
Yeah, I see what
and
you mean. But in my example, in my technocracy example, I wouldn't. Trump and Biden obviously wouldn't even be up for an option, right? Because they're not technical in any way. They're not
right.
really
So
smart.
where will you draw the source of your popular legitimacy?
I mean, I don't necessarily think it has to be democratic.
No,
In
it,
terms of like who or maybe I'm misspoken or not understanding, but
well, how are you going to have a government that the people are not going to be so dissatisfied with that they're going to take up arms and consider you illegitimate as a government?
yeah, I mean, in this current state, we're obvious the governments already exist, so obviously we're not starting from a clean slate. So I think in the U.S., for example, there could be ways to do that. You know, if there was someone that's more technical, like I don't know, like a popular tech CEO like Elon Musk or something, or any sort of Jeff Bezos or any like. Jeff Bezos maybe isn't popular to the average American, but Elon Musk is a good example because he is popular to Americans. If he ran for president, I think he would win easily. And so even if he's not, if even if he's not the most technical person, that's sort of the image that he's marketed himself as. So that would be like a first step. And maybe later leaders after him would be actual tech CEOs, for example. But that would be an example for me. Someone
But
like Elon Musk
you,
would be perfect because he's
but
popular
yeah,
and he's yeah.
but the reason Musk is popular, right, is actually not because of anything relating to technology, actually, but because he projects a very ideological image of a kind of fantasy, right? Going to
Through tech
Mars
though, right?
and
Through tech.
yeah, a science fiction fantasy, yes,
Exactly.
but
Yeah.
it's still something ideological, right? It's still something pathological. It's like the pathos. It's not this pure kind of cold, rational, calculating technology. It's all manner of human charisma and human fantasy and human unconscious desire and so on and so on.
No, I agree, but I don't have to be that ideological, right? If we were implementing this in real life, I wouldn't mind that someone like Elon Musk actually ran and won. He would be a first step to actually getting a technocracy going. And
No,
I
no,
think
I understand what you're saying, but what I'm trying to say is that Elon's popularity does not come from his technical expertise. So we
I just
already
yeah, I mean that is true to an
we're
extent.
witnessing a so here we're witnessing a contradiction between pure technical governance, right?
Yeah.
And the kind of more, I guess, ideological stuff that's like spiritual and very ill defined kind of more subterrestrial legitimation from the people, right? So there is this contradiction that has to be settled, and I don't think a technocracy would be capable of selling it. Now, Elon, while popular, um, I don't even think would be able to muster the necessary legitimation and willpower from the American people in order to realize such an all-encompassing technocratization of the society. I mean, for example, let me just put it this way. The more you want to be technocratic, the more you have to attend to the people's spiritual, ideological, etc., needs, right? And the Communist Party has been able to get away with its technocracy, so to speak, precisely because through its history and through events like the Cultural Revolution, which taken on a transcendent kind of prohibited unconscious status, it has taken care of all of that ideological human stuff, right? And only because it can take that for granted is it able to get away with its sweeping and, by Western standards, non-democratic technocracy.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but I think Elon would still be an example. I understand what you mean when you say. I think the technocrat leader would have to sell to the American people in some way. So they would be doing PR, sort of how Elon Musk does it,
Well,
right? More futuristic image of the U.S. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't sell that to the American people and then also be, also have like a sort of a deep state of sorts. There's some sort of board of actual expertise that actually can determine their actual technical prowess, right? So there could sort of be like a two-end sort of thing where you sell to the American people this future of like, this some sort of like solar punk or, like some sort of futuristic vision of America. And then behind the scenes actually deal with the technical portion of actually running a society.
right. Well,
So you
believe
can
it or
do both.
not, the providing a kind of fantasy, and I don't mean fantasy in a denigrating sense, but just something that's like, something that tickles our kind of our longing for like an aesthetic, right? That is actually not enough. Projecting an ideology or a fantasy is not enough to actually maintain power for a sovereign. So in China's case, for example, it's not just because the Communist Party has an ideology that it sells the Chinese people that it gets away with all the technical stuff. It also entrusts the Chinese people with their own independent relationship to verifying the legitimation of this ideology through and this is changing now, but it's transitioning into a new form, what we can broadly call a popular form of property, right? So the
Through like
Chinese
land or
people,
something. Yeah, like through
land,
land or something.
precisely
Yeah.
land, yes. And then it's shifting from agricultural land now to single unit apartments that can be owned by the Chinese citizen. And it's not just single unit apartments, but it's also becoming easier, slowly but surely, for the average Chinese citizen to take out credit from banks in order to start businesses. So all of these things represent a type of economic trust that the government is giving the people that is not necessarily something that can be premised by technical efficiency, but is more a deeper form of trust between a government and its people.
Yeah, I agree what you're saying. Obviously, the way the U.S. would do it wouldn't be exactly the way Marxist-Leninist government would do it, right? But I still and I don't necessarily think the American people would want land necessarily. I think you can sort of promise them some sort of value of the country in different ways, not necessarily having it to be land.
Yeah,
That's debatable, obviously, but uh,
I
I
do
think there.
agree. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. I don't think it has to be land necessarily, and like you said, China's, I guess, moving more towards like apartments and houses and whatnot, which I guess is still sort of, it's still gonna be land, right? It's still land at the end of the day. But I think the American people can get, you know, they can get a piece of the pie, and it doesn't necessarily have to be land. It would be in the American context, but and I don't necessarily think that technocrats would care to be as pro people like the Chinese government is, but
Well,
yeah.
that's where the problem comes in because you can probably recognize that there is a paradox of populism we're facing, right? So, for
Yeah.
example, for something as mundane as taking vaccines, right, and public trust in the technocrats who are making the vaccines, um, there's no trust, right? There's no trust in the pharmaceutical companies producing vaccines. So when the technical experts want to do something as mundane, right, as have a vaccine mandate, there's a populist uproar. I mean, look what's going on in Canada with the truckers. So how are technocrats going to resolve the paradox between trying to run a country as technically efficient as possible and also feeding the beast, so to speak? The beast being the popular, um, the wild and popular, and more kind of spiritual sentiments of the people, right?
Yeah, I see
Because,
what you're saying.
yeah,
Yeah, it's kind of a contradiction. Yeah, I would say you could sort of, and I think governments try to do this maybe because again, our governments in the U.S. and in the West aren't engineers and aren't technical people. They either see it and don't address it, or they don't even see the issue at all. But I think you can sort of slip, like a pill. You can sort of like feed the American people and then slip a pill in the sense that you could. I think if you offered the American people uh, enough benefits, they would take the vaccine. And if the messenger of the vaccine was like Trump, for example, or Elon, for example, someone that's actually popular, I think they could slip. They can actually get more people to take the vaccine with enough, with enough push and with some sort of benefit coming along with it, not than just you're going to get fired, but hey, here's the vaccine, and then here's, I don't know, this is sort of crude, but here's money, or here's this or that. Whatever the benefit is, I think you can sort of slip the pill in with the dessert, so to
I
speak.
remember debating Destiny and actually arguing your point, but he also brought up the point, and that wasn't exactly what I was arguing, but it's still a good point. I mean, which is that Trump, surprisingly, right, when he spoke favorably about the vaccine, he was booed by the crowd in one of his speeches, which means there is a more fundamental issue that the public does not trust the intentions of the government as a whole for telling people to get this vaccine, or at least trying to force them to, right? So you have a more fundamental issue of trust where people cannot help but see political and human motivations and intentions behind the policy making of technocrats, right? People don't trust these technocrats to have so much immense power behind them because the technocrats may say that they're acting on behalf of the cold and blind, impartial facts of science, but people tend to see that science is anything but that, right? I mean, that's why you have so many conspiracy theories, like the view that the earth is flat, for example, can proliferate, right? Because people don't trust this idea of a cold, impartial, calculating science. They know that
Yeah, I don't
the
think you can actually sell it to the people that way. I don't think you necessarily need to. I think the technocrats that you see now are sort of explaining to the people like they're scientists or something. I don't expect them to be scientists, right? Yeah, I would sell them an image, and then also behind the scenes, actually implement the actual mandates. It wouldn't be, I'm not going to tell them, hey, this is why logically ABC why you should take it. I would sell them an image, or give them some sort of popular rhetoric and then slip that in behind the scenes. And I think that's how you would have to do it. um, but yeah, just sort of addressing that. And I don't think Trump does that, right? And none of the technocrats now do that. They sort of Technocrats will just tell you, hey, take the vaccine, otherwise you're going to kill other people. And
but
that's
this
not
is
really a.
but don't you think this is also why technocrats are not capable of sovereign rule, right? All they can do really is kind of act as a servant of a sovereign's will, but they cannot themselves draw the will to actually rule a people.
Yeah, I mean, you might be right. Yeah, maybe the technocrat, so to speak, at the top would have to be more charismatic and understand that portion of it. But I don't think you have to necessarily separate the two skill. I think there are CEOs out there that are examples of someone who could be charismatic and also who has a technical background
Another
as well.
issue, which is why I actually don't think the Chinese ideology hampers China, is because I actually think technocracies have a tendency to stagnate, and I would predict they would because there haven't really been many examples in history. Because technocrats, since they're operating based off of kind of this data, and which means precedent, things that have already happened, they're unable to take the risks the contingent risks of bold risks into the unknown that only someone with a kind of sixth sense of a broader popular spiritual orientation, in order to actually define and frame the terms of the kind of Greek techne in the first place, the form in the first place. Like a technocrat doesn't understand the deeper laws of the dialectic governing laws of social revolution, right? How it happens that the data that they actually are working with comes to actually present itself in the way that it does. Like it has the data, but it doesn't have the why behind the data. Like for example, um,
But did
deep.
those two necessarily? Did they have to be separate necessarily? I mean, you could imagine someone that has the ability to combine them both, right? Or
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
or maybe
I
implement a
do
process.
think ideally both should be combined, but the problem is that when technocrats rule, they are blind to the deeper laws and forces of historical change and social revolution, which makes them kind of. I mean, there are examples of this in Marxist-Leninist countries, for example. Broadly, there was the example under Stalin, right, where Stalin did initiate this revolution, this social revolution, which drew in more of the Russian masses into culture and politics and society and law. And this led to the rise of a technocracy. And when it came time to initiate another one of these revolutions, right, to have a revolution in what we call in Marxism the forces of production, the technocrats actually turned against Stalin, right, under the disguise that he didn't know what he was doing technically. But this technocratic mentality only disguised a very untechnocratic defense of the status quo in terms of like a class war, basically. So
Yeah, I see what you're
technocrats
saying.
haven't.
Technocrat. Yeah,
Yeah,
they
it's
have a
like
blind spot.
they
Yeah.
will defend the status quo in the name of technical expertise, but it has nothing to do with any blind technical knowledge, but just the defense of the ruling class, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I see what you're saying. I could see that being a potential problem. I don't necessarily think it would be detrimental to keep a technocracy going. I think if maybe there needs to be like a sort of like a board of directors sort of system, similar to how businesses are run, where you do have more of that spiritual and philosophical person on the board, for example. They don't all have to be engineers, right? But if they're, but I think you could sort of that approach would, sort of to address both fronts that you're sort of discussing or you're sort of mentioning. I think those things could hypothetically be addressed in some way. And of course, no society is perfect, so there's going to be issues regardless. But I think that's a start at least to a better society. And I think America and most of the Western world, they're sort of trying to do both, right? They're sort of trying to be technocratic, but also trying to linger on to and hold on to some of the more spiritual and philosophical part of their countries. But it's not working because of various issues, of course. But I think there sort of is a way to for America to sort of go all the way technocratic. And like I said, someone like Elon Musk or someone that's popular, that's more that's more seen as technical at least, could sort of jumpstart that, in my opinion. But yeah, I guess that's the first point out of the three. I don't know if you wanted to move on to the second one or not, but
I think the point is kind of still unresolved, but for the sake of time, if you want, we could move on.
yeah, I mean, I don't think I think it would just be a agree to disagree sort of thing, because I don't think, like you said, there's not that many examples of technocracies out there, so there's not much that we could point to. Um, More of a philosophical debate, I guess, rather than sort of a results oriented one. But yeah, so point two, again, I sort of just touched on it, but I think America could adopt this technocratic approach. I think it's not doing it enough. I think trying to limit Google, Meta, Apple, and some of the tech companies now are doing just more harm. I think I know at some point they're probably going to try to break those companies up right in the U.S. And I think they shouldn't. I think they should just let them continue to do what they're doing.
Can
Um,
you repeat the first thing you said? A bottle dropped on the floor. I couldn't hear it. This
yeah,
first
yeah.
point, second point. I mean,
So basically that the U.S. government, it appears that they're gonna at some point try to break up these quote unquote tech monopolies. But my point is, I think the tech monopolies should be unleashed. For this future technocracy. Like I said, I think most of the Western world is trying to become technocracies. They're just doing it in a terrible way.
I
And so
actually
I would,
think. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I'm done, basically.
So, not to be ideological, but in Marxist terms, we have a word called the forces of production. And to me, tech has not actually replaced the forces of production, but has become an interface with which these forces of production can be guided. And because of that, I actually think that the tech monopolies are limiting right now the forces of production, as all monopolies inevitably do. And that actually successfully breaking up tech monopolies will allow new platforms, more or less, to flourish to an even greater degree than the ones before. So it's almost kind of like a tree gets overgrown, you chop down the tree, and, it has seeds, and there's, like 5 new trees in its stead. And so I think that's the paradigm we have to start thinking, is that these tech monopolies, like Google, for example, tried to solve the problem of any company is inevitably going to become short-sighted in its ability to actually have a vision. And the reason for that is because being able to draw a vision for the future and for technologies is a result of a specific relationship between human beings, people, and governments, right? Like, for example, Google and the tech platforms arose from a very specific relationship between an economic relationship, I should say, between the people and the government after World War II, and also the research universities and the grants given by the government that invested in them. And this is the fruit of that was Silicon Valley, right? That
Yeah.
thing, right? But eventually there comes to be an upper limit to what monopolies can do and how much they can innovate. And Google tried to solve this problem, for example, by just buying up all of the newest tech startups. But the issue here is that Google, there's a conflict of interest sometimes because Google doesn't know how to integrate some of these new technologies from these startups with its overall ecosystem, which inevitably leads to buying up a lot of new promising startups only to basically like neutralize them from ever becoming anything, right? And this is what a lot of these tech platforms are starting to do, and it's leading to, in my view, a stagnation in innovation.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree. I think part of that also is that the government is sort of not looking at, the tech. I guess the purpose of the government that the U.S. has is not necessarily to help the tech companies per se. It's more ideological than that. I think. In my view, is that if the government that we currently had were more engineers and tech focused, even if Google and some of these quote unquote monopolies existed, I think they can work with the government to sort of be more innovative. I don't necessarily think that the innovation is being impeded because they're monopolies per se, but because the government sort of tries to cut them down, but they do it ineffectively. And then because of their own, business shortcomings or whatever short-sightedness, there can also be, I guess impeding of innovation. But I don't necessarily know if you can measure that in any way either. So,
I
the
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that the problem though is that these companies are accumulating an immense concentration of wealth that is coming from the rents, basically, of the use of their platform and also intellectual property, right? The problem is that these tech platforms are accumulating so much of these rents on top of infrastructure that comes from the government. And this infrastructure is outdated. And the tech monopolies are not able to replace the government infrastructure they take for granted, but it's almost like they're using them parasitically, while just accumulating this immense amount of money and wealth, and not using that money in a way that actually goes back to where the source was, which was, from the government and from the people and so on and so on. And I'm not saying they should give more of their wealth to our government because our government is horribly inefficient, and I agree with that. It's completely outdated. But I also think that also incriminates the tech companies too because it's this very inefficient government that these tech companies owe their existence to and still rely upon to continue to exist. If we fundamentally upgraded our infrastructure and fundamentally, made investments from the government actually, or through government banks, I should say, through a central government bank into like promising small tech companies, not with the purpose of neutralizing them, but with the purpose of actually giving them a chance. I actually think that these tech monopolies would collapse. I mean, the free ride and free pass that they're getting, that our government has given them, I think would come to an end. Um, to
Necessarily
me,
disagree, but I think if even if let's say the government spent, I don't know, like $20 trillion and really tried to upgrade the infrastructure in a real meaningful way, I think the Googles of the world and Amazons would still have an advantage. Even if the smaller businesses and startups do have a chance, I still think Google and Amazon just
I
due
actually
to their yeah.
so I want to preface and clarify. I think our government is horribly inefficient. It's a horribly inefficient, overgrown bureaucracy. So I'm not saying I want the government to just throw $20 trillion to upgrade infrastructure. I think we do need a fundamental revolution in this country. I'm not talking in like an ideological sense, but let me just put it this way, right? So we need an institutional revolution. We need to break up. We need to like extinguish a lot of these bureaucracies and a lot of these red tape and just restructure how our government works and how it functions, right?
Yeah.
That's a very important thing we have to do before we talk about printing more money. We need to establish something like a central bank, a government central bank. We need to reinstate things like Glass-Steagall, which promote a productivist-oriented developmental policy on part of the government. Now, once we do all of these things, the special interests and special relationships that are in bed with our government, like Wall Street, and in turn from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, those will collapse. So these monopolies will no longer have the advantage that they do by being in collaboration with the current kind of corrupt bureaucracy. And I think this would lead to a blank slate where, new startups and new technologies and new paradigms will have a chance. I think Google and Amazon are actually symptoms of our stagnation. I think if we want to actual real, unleash the forces of production and increase technological innovation, we have to look at these monopolies for what they are. They're massive hoarders of wealth who don't use this wealth productively.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. I do think that just objectively, the U.S. will probably collapse at some point in the near future. But the way I see it is the power grab that's going to kind of come from that is going to be, I think it's going to come a lot of it from the tech companies. So that would be the opportunity for these tech companies to really seize power, to
I
try to, yeah.
um I've seen speculation about that before. I just don't see these tech companies as having the necessary independence.
Like they already have infrastructure. They already have, unless the U.S., unless the currencies just collapse worldwide, they still have immense amounts of power and influence. Still,
Well, I
these
don't think they have enough independent infrastructure. I think you're kind of underestimating the extent to which big tech is still not only reliant on the US government, but even worse, more reliant on two things, right? The Democratic Party, I mean, most of all, reliant on the Democratic Party, and also Wall Street. Silicon Valley has never actually declared any independence from Wall Street, so it's still beholden to the same people who control the Democrats, which is the Wall Street financial class.
No, I don't
Um,
necessarily disagree with that, but I'm saying like let's imagine tomorrow if just everything started burning and collapsing, right? Like the
yeah,
government, like people no longer believed in the government and everything collapsed. Like objectively, even though I do agree that a lot of the infrastructure that companies in general rely on are sort of comes from the government. I do still think that objectively, um, right now, these tech companies still have capital to sort of gather and try to seize power in some sort of way. I
Well,
think they
they
still would.
have
They have people, right? They have employees. A lot of them probably are already moving away solely from the U.S. dollar, right? They can see that it's there's crypto. I know there's people that are starting to invest, companies that are starting to invest in other types of currencies. So they're seeing the writing on the wall already. So I think they would have capital to sort of utilize to try to seize power in some way. Now,
um
maybe they might not win out, but I think if it were to sort of, in the immediate sense, that would be sort of how a technocracy could possibly happen.
I
Um,
think in that kind of scenario, which would be like a warlord scenario where like power is up for grabs, basically, right? I
yeah,
don't actually think big tech. I think big tech would completely collapse. I mean, it's reliant on the government to such an extent that it would be non-operational, not only in the technical sense of like running their companies, technologies, and platforms, but even in like the organizational sense of having a corporation. I mean, the whole thing would just come tumbling down. But on the other hand, you would have gangs, right? Gangs would survive an apocalypse because the reason for that is because gangs are organizations that command a loyalty from their members, not simply because they pay them as employees, but because they take like oaths and blood vows and this fundamental sense of loyalty and brotherhood and willingness to die for the gang and all of the dynamism of like states and like political loyalty. You do find that in gangs, but in a tech company, I mean, you don't find. I mean, employees of Amazon are not going to die for Jeff Bezos. They're not going to, take up arms and sacrifice him. I mean, maybe you could say that
they can
Elon's.
hire they can hire military though, right? If they have capital, like the companies themselves,
They would have to be so yeah. They would use crypto, right? Because the U.S. dollar would be worthless at this point.
or other government currency, right? Like the won or yen or whatever else they would
Yeah,
hold.
but um, the problem with that is, in terms of hiring private mercenaries, is that they will never be able to um, draw from like a segment of the population to fight for them, right? Which means that in terms of a war, they'd just be holding out against a mass of people that are fundamentally hostile to them, which is the people, right? Gangs, on the other hand, can replicate. I mean, like, I'll just put it this way, right? The reasons why people join gangs is because of some kind of fundamental human loyalty, right? It's not just because of that, but that's what cements, it's like a blood oath, right? Whereas if it's just for hire, then when the going gets tough, will mercenaries really die for the dollar? No, right? So all of like the dynamics of how a state is built and how a warlord becomes a sovereign are not going to be there for a tech company. What they will be there for a gang.
No, I agree that maybe gangs that are based on, like you said, based on loyalty versus just money is going to be, yeah, it's probably going to be stronger, right, and more, more cohesive in a way. But I still do think that, and obviously this is hypothetical. We would have no idea what would actually happen. But I do still think that if the country collapsed today, a lot of people would be out of work. I think people would willingly take any job. And I guess in this scenario, being like arms for these tech companies wouldn't be out of the question. You
Right,
know,
but we have to understand things like the origin of money and the origin of like how economies, right? And at some point you do get to this kind of Shakespearean or Freudian like like how are social bonds glued in the first place, right? And gangs really do tap into the essence of that in ways that mercenaries don't. So no matter how desperate people are, when you are being I'll put it this way: when you're being hired as a mercenary because you're unemployed, you're engaging in a voluntary transaction, right? I will give you my services and you will give me money. Well, that transaction is operating within the confines of rules ultimately, right? Like
yeah.
it's not theft, it's a rule. Well, gangs aren't limited by the rules of any market, right? When a gang gets a soldier, it's not because they were hired and, they're merely transacting some money or resource for you. This more fundamental glue that binds people together is being used, right? You have a loyalty to a brotherhood, you have loyalty to a cause or an ideology or something, or maybe a culture or a community. Something fundamental there is going on where people are willing to give their life, right? Um,
No,
for
I
and
get
for an
what you're
army.
saying. Yeah, I get what you're saying. All I'm saying is that the technocracies would, or like the tech companies would have resources to use in some sort of a breakdown of society, and this is
Yeah,
like not even considering outside investment.
but
Obviously during
as human being,
revolutions,
sorry.
other countries usually invest in
Yeah,
revolutions, right? So like China, or a lot of these countries that already have like Google and Tesla and Amazon in their countries already might have interest investing in whichever side is going to war. So we couldn't even rule out these tech companies getting funding from outside governments. So, obviously this is a complete hypothetical, and we would have
yeah,
no
yeah.
idea.
No, I mean it's good to entertain. I think, but the thing is that these tech companies are not going to be able to give. The reason why I don't think they could have any legitimacy is because what they would lack is purpose. They would lack an actual vision and reason, something to die for, right? To be loyal to, an idea, some kind of logos, right? This is what tech companies lack. And political parties and gangs, on the other hand, have that. I mean, I don't have any experience in this myself, but for example, my parents did come from a country that was experiencing like a thing like this, right? Which was the civil war in Lebanon, right? I don't know if you're
Right.
familiar, but that was a civil war where there was like 1,000 gangs and 1,000 parties and 1,000 groups that were basically spontaneously um, clans and factions and families. I mean, if mercenaries in this scenario, I mean, they would just be holding out against this whole chaos, but they would not have a chance basically to vie for legitimacy of statehood and government.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, we hypothetically, what is left of the Democratic Party could try to align with the tech companies in that way, right? So you never know the kind of alliances that would be made to sort of push forward. But I still do think that the tech companies have enough capital and enough influence to where they would sort of try to leech on to whichever factions sort of winning out and sort of side with them ideologically, and hopefully that springboards them on to being ruling class.
The issue is that in a warlord era, capital is um is uh is accumulated at the point of a gun. It's not like something you get from market transactions. Well, sometimes it could be, but you have warlords roaming around, and let's say there's an oil refinery. You don't pay for it. You bring your guns and you take that refinery and you make fuel, right? Or let's say there's peasants farming land. You don't go to those peasants and buy their crops. You, at the point of a gun, exact a tax from them, right? Say, we need this much grain and housing and so on and so on. So the distribution of capital becomes reset. I mean, like, for example, a tech company may have like 500 Bitcoins, right? But because there's no environment of free voluntary market exchange, but instead of a war, basically a war of all against all, where people are fighting for resources and goods at the barrel of a gun, I mean, they can try and pay for the oil refinery, for example, but um, that's not going to do them any good when you can just take it from the barrel of a gun, you know?
No, I see what you're saying. Yeah, obviously guns are going to be more, they're going to be more effective in controlling people than money when it's broken down. But I do think fundamentally in this new like crypto economy, I do think they could, people freely have, crypto wallets on their phones. So you don't necessarily even need a institutional bank. Some of these crypto wallet companies are even outside of the U.S. So,
Yeah, I know.
hypothetically, yeah. So hypothetically, we would all have wallets on our phones. Now you can make the argument that the phone services would all go down, which I guess that'd be a fair point. But assuming that somehow the phone services are still online in some sort of way, people do have some way of, capturing or retaining some sort of like, money for to spend. But I ultimately agree. Realistically, there probably wouldn't be a technocracy forming in a revolution.
Or
I
like in a
think
in a warlord era, right?
Yeah, in like a warlord era. Yeah, there probably wouldn't be a technocracy. Maybe if like again, maybe whatever's left of the Democratic Party, maybe they latch onto that and maybe try to force their way that way. But realistically, I think sort of the technocracy route would be getting someone like Elon Musk or a tech CEO that's actually popular with the American people and try to get them elected. That would probably be the only realistic way of getting some. Because, like I said, I see the West as sort of being a technocracy, but they're just not good at it. So
Yeah.
my argument,
Again, I mean, not to like pull this bullshit because it's kind of not that. It's kind of
yeah,
besides the point. But you know, Elon can't run, right?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
because he's
Yeah,
from
I know
South
he's
Africa.
outside. Yeah,
Yeah,
obviously, but he's
yeah.
he's uh, he's like South African, right? So he
Yeah, but
couldn't
I get what
actually run.
your point is. Like
Yeah,
someone like Elon, or maybe if there's
exactly.
a change in legislation, hypothetically, like something like that. I get
Yeah,
what
yeah,
you're saying.
he's a
I
perfect example because he's actually popular, but it would have to be someone like him that's a
Yeah.
U.S. citizen.
Well,
But
I think the issue is that they would not only have to be popular and well liked, but they would also have to be populists, right? And a populist is basically promising the people that they're gonna they're gonna drain the swamp, crush the establishment, and give the people something, right? And I don't really think Elon has that in him. I think what Elon does is kind of he's popular because he gives people something to look forward to and he stokes our imagination. But what he's not is a warrior. He's not like a militant leader who's gonna, direct, the army of the people to storm the headquarters and, drain the swamp and all this kind of Trump stuff, right?
yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
he
he's not
does.
the perfect example. He's the
Yeah.
great best example I can pull, right? But it would have to be probably be someone that's more. It would probably be like a combination of him, Andrew Yang, and probably someone that's more. Because Andrew Yang is probably more political than Elon Musk would be, but he's not as popular.
I think
But
if anyone wants substantial change in the country, I don't really think it's possible within the current political parties that exist. I just
yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah.
Realistically, it probably this government's
Because
probably
even
sort of.
Andrew Yang, I mean, like, it's so sad, but, you know, even if he were to run as a Democrat and become very popular, I mean, there is a Democratic corporate establishment. Like, it's like a machine, and they would just snuff him out, basically, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's not the best example, but yeah, I think the U.S. is basically done for. But I think again, they're probably. I don't know if it'll be in our lifetime. But I'm more arguing from like a ideological point of view rather than realistically. Realistically, yeah, this country's probably done. But what I'd like to see would be more of a technocracy, sort of in the way China runs it. So yeah, that's my second point. I guess maybe we could get to our last point.
Yeah, we can move on to the third.
Okay, so the third point would be why I would be against Chinese polarity in any sort of way. This sort of obviously we can see that China is probably going to be the number one country, the hegemony sooner or later. But I think this is not good personally, just because I think it's going to affect some of the southeast, some of the Asian countries that currently have you know protection under the U.S. hegemony. Example number one would be Japan. I'm partly Japanese, so they would probably go after Japan first, right? Due to World War II, and I'm pretty sure there's not good blood between the two countries. So I think some of the Asian countries would kind of get the wrath of China uh, if China grows to be even stronger. Uh,
I I don't think China has bad intentions toward Japan. Um, I actually think Japan would probably fare better under Chinese guidance or hegemony as opposed to the U.S. because we can see what's going on in Japan now is that they have a demographic crisis. There's the economy's stagnating and the population's declining. I think a more special relationship with China and Chinese investment and infrastructure as opposed to the US led model would probably help the Japanese economy and the Japanese people in a profoundly better way. I think the only people who would lose out, though, would probably be the Japanese ruling class and the kind of establishment, which seems to not be faring that badly, despite the stagnation the majority of Japanese people are facing.
Yeah, I mean, idea, yeah, like, yeah, if best case scenario, I think that would be the case. But I think just due to recent, history, I don't think it would fare that either. If somehow China took over Japan or had so much influence that, there was a lot of Chinese in Japan, I think Japanese people would just become second class citizens, frankly.
I don't think that's true because I think China does have a lot of sensitivity around the discussion of Japan's role in World War II and the whole history. But when it comes to Japanese people, I don't think Chinese people harbor bad feelings toward the Japanese people. I actually think there's a kind of more recent and resurgent sense of um now this is extremely controversial, right? Like to say this, but there's so much nuance to it that it'd be hard to explain, but before the 30s, right?
Yeah.
Before the period of or the 20s, I forgot when, but I think there is some Chinese sympathy with Japan's initial modernization after the Meiji Restoration and the aspiration of just this idea of an independent East Asian power. I think Chinese people, thinkers in China are starting to kind of look upon this with sympathy and admiration. Now, obviously, the Japanese invasion of China and the World War II, yes, I mean it's a complete black spot in history. But this more overall view of kind of Japan's vision before of creating like um an independent Asian polarity, I think it's something that is very much admired in China today, especially more recently.
Okay. But if China had a more revengeful approach and the U.S. pulled out of Japan, what would stop China from just going in and invading Japan? There would be no
I don't
protection
think
technically, right?
China has any reason to want to invade Japan. Japan
Maybe not
doesn't.
physically, but even just being, even just financially or just a kind of a grip on Japan, in a way to where Japan, like you said,
Well,
essentially.
let me put it this way: China, that when the communist government in China was first came to power, right under Mao, um, the Japanese collaborator he was the boy emperor of the Qing dynasty, and he was reinstated in the Republic of in Manchuria during
Yeah,
there was a Puyi, the Japanese puppet government in Manchuria.
yeah.
He was a Japanese collaborator, right? I mean he directly collaborated with the imperial Japanese government, and the government in Manchuria was pretty brutal toward the Red Army and the People's Liberation Army and so on. Um, but even he was like completely forgiven, right? He was allowed to be a normal Chinese citizen. He didn't even face any repercussions. So I don't think that the Chinese view is one of revenge against Japan at all. I mean, if they're not even gonna like do anything against this huge collaborator, I don't think they have any bad designs or vengeful designs on Japan.
I mean, I guess that would be a sort of a fate, sort of a gamble that I guess Japan wouldn't want to even sort of deal with, right? Like the way Japan is now, they're going to be safe under the U.S. no matter what. So
I
there's no
actually
real.
I don't know about that because it seems like a lot of the majority of the aggression is coming from the U.S. against China, and China's posture is basically defensive, right? And because of that, Japan is endangered under the U.S. basically because it might get entangled or thrown into a conflict between the U.S. and Japan that in no way benefits Japan or Japan has anything to do with.
Yeah, I mean, like the dispute in the South China Sea between Japan and China. You could say that's sort of influenced by America, which probably is, right? Because Japan is able to be more aggressive, knowing that the U.S.'s allies would be allies in that conflict. But that's like an example, if you saw it from a purely pessimistic point of view, that there's already sort of tension there, just merely based off of history and just even proximity, right, to each other. And if the U.S. protection was gone, I think a lot of countries would sort of see Chinese influence grow a lot more, even if it wasn't a complete invasion, which it probably wouldn't be in this day and age. It would still, I think, be enough influence to where, I mean, you see it in Africa, right? There's a lot of African political parties that have been solely created to try to remove Chinese people from their country. So that's like an example that I would probably see in Japan, where there would be just so much Chinese influence that effectively, even if they weren't taken over physically, they would basically become second-class citizens in some sort of in like the Israel-Palestine kind of way.
Well, the thing in Africa though is that what you're seeing in Africa is that China is making investments in Africa, um, productive investments that can be paid off eventually. And when they're not able to be paid off, the Chinese banks have been very forgiving in terms of debts and so on. So they're not tricking Africans into a bad deal. It's just that a lot of these governments in Africa are very corrupt. And so they're not negotiating the terms of these deals with China in a way that's favorable to the people. Well, that's not really China's fault because China isn't propping up any governments or having coups to have governments favorable to it. It's just working with whatever government
It has,
um,
yeah.
is there,
Africa,
right?
yeah.
Is in charge. As far
Right.
as Japan's concerned, I don't think there would be any threats to Japanese sovereignty as far as disputed territories are concerned. Um, China seems to be willing to work with countries bilaterally to resolve these negotiations and disputes. It just doesn't like it when like Europeans or Americans get involved because it sees this as not only an encroachment on China's sovereignty, but on an encroachment on the sovereignty of both parties involved. Like, why should the U.S. be involved in a dispute between two Asian neighbors, right? East Asian neighbors, which with very very ancient historical ties, right? So
Yeah, but
I
the conflicts now are with the implicit U.S. Backing, right? Or maybe
yeah
even explicit U.S. backing.
yeah
And in this hypothetical, Japan would be, well, this probably wouldn't be a case, but if Japan was on its own, China would have no worry about U.S. threats. Maybe Japan would have other allies that sort of can try to back them up, which is probably would be the case. But either way, if that power does not equal to China, they could sort of bully them, right? Which would be my concern.
I don't think China would act as a bully in regards to Japan because when we see countries that China is very well within its capacity of bullying, um, neighbors like Afghanistan, for example, China could have bullied the shit out of the Afghan government under Hamid Karzai, right? But under that government, I think it was actually under the Taliban. Even that would even be better, right? Um, when it came to negotiations of territorial disputes, China was extremely generous. I mean, it settled a negotiation in which it gave the majority of the disputed territory to Afghanistan and only took a small part, right? Because it was an unsettled boundary, right?
Yeah.
So I think when we look at precedent where China was able to act as a bully, it hasn't.
Yeah, but wouldn't you still say that that would be China still looking at how would the U.S. react if they were to bully these countries in this way?
I
Like it
don't
would still
think
threaten the U.S. in some sort of way, right?
I don't
Or
think the
even the EU.
U.S. would have been able to do anything about it.
But wouldn't don't you think that they would see that as China trying to grow even stronger than you can kind of see it with Ukraine, right? Like just because Russia and Ukraine are having their tension, the U.S. and the West in general see that as a threat, like an
I think a
encroachment.
good example is Taiwan, which is
Yeah, Taiwan's a good
comparable.
example.
Yeah,
Yeah. Taiwan's a good
but
example. Yeah.
Tai- China, well, China doesn't even really bully Taiwan, right? It even respects the system in place in Taiwan. It's just insists that Taiwan is, I mean, part of China, right?
Well, informally it is, right? So that's why I didn't use that example,
Yeah,
because you
yeah,
could make the argument that formally it is literally the Republic of China. But
right, yeah.
um, yeah,
So the issue is that I don't think China is another Nazi Germany, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think they have designs to conquer or bully or humiliate neighbors or people. I think they want, sincerely, in their material self interest, they want peaceful, win-win um, coexistence and mutual development. I think that's how China's economy works, right? I don't think it has any interest in creating an economy that's based on war and conquest and
Yeah,
bullying.
I don't think they would be Nazi Germany or like fascist states at all. I think they would still. I think it would be more economic. So you would probably see a lot of Chinese companies in Japan, right? Tencent and all the tech companies and all the other businesses. You'll just see. So it would basically be I could see a scenario where there would be a ton of Chinese people in Japan physically, just
Yeah.
as citizens. And if you know Japanese culture, you know that Japan doesn't really like
I
outsiders
think
living in the country. So that
Japan
would yeah, so that would be gross to the Japanese people. But I
there
think if China had that power, there would be no way for Japan to really
well
get stuff.
if China has a huge amount of economic power within Japan, that would be because the Japanese themselves found it profitable. But Japanese sovereignty will not be encroached upon by China. So if Japan wants to limit immigration from any country it sees fit to, I mean, it's still able to exercise the sovereign will of within the bounds of its territory, right? I mean, China's not going to tell the Japanese government that they can't limit immigration or they can't do this or they can't try to invest in their own companies. When it comes down to it, I think if there's too much Chinese companies that have power in Japan, that's probably a problem internal to Japanese politics. If the Japanese people want to have their own platforms and own businesses, that's their responsibility to, have a more protectionist government and implement policies that favor Japanese industry. And China is not going to interfere in that.
Well, my point would be that they would forcefully do that, right? I think they would because it would benefit China financially to have businesses set up in China or in Japan, right? You can make that argument.
But
Um,
the minute it has to do so forcefully is when it has to bring in two
Military,
things
right,
China
right.
does not want to have to deal with, right? Which is a military occupation or coercion and politics, right? And China does not. China wants economic deals. It does not. It
Yeah, but
wants to.
Japan, if you know about, I mean, Japanese defense force is pathetic. Like they would stand no chance to China.
Well, I'll put it this way. So Japan is a consumer-based economy, right?
Right. Yep.
It's not a resource-rich place like Africa
Yeah.
is, which China actually does need economically, right?
Right.
And China has been very favorable and fair in the way it works with African countries. It's not forcing anything. There's a mutual win-win benefit. African countries need capital investments and China needs resources. So there's this kind of mutual relationship they have going on that benefits both of them. As far as what China needs from Japan though, I don't know what China would necessarily need, even from a perspective of self interest, what they would need from Japan, right? I mean, yeah, I mean it's a large consumer market, I guess, for Chinese goods, but it's not nearly as large as, say, Africa or the Middle East or India, um, or even Europe. So I don't know what China would gain from interfering in Japan so much.
Yeah, well, I guess my argument would be that I think naturally Japan would be protectionist economically, right? If the US were to collapse, right? Like 150 years ago, the West had to force Japan to open up. I think naturally Japanese people tend to be more conservative in that way, where they're more protectionist. So if in this hypothetical scenario China did want to set up shop in Japan forcefully, my argument would be that they would be able to militarily if they wanted to. And if I guess if someone in if the Chinese ruling class were to be ill-willed, I don't see why they wouldn't want to do that. It would benefit them in any way, and they would sort of get they could if they were vengeful, they could do that, right? Just based on the last 100 years of how
I
Japan.
think maybe you could try and make the case. I would completely disagree with it. Would be more rational is that Japan would be an economic competitor to Chinese industry, right? And that's why China would want to stifle Japan because it would compete with China on the international stage. But there are countries that already compete with China on the international stage. I mean, also Iran, right, is a rising power which is going to have its own domestic industry and there's going to be all sorts of competitors with Chinese brands that are going to emerge on the international stage. I
But
think
Iran's like a Chinese. It's in the Chinese sphere, though, right? So Iran wouldn't be the best
yeah, I mean,
example.
but that
Yeah.
just goes to show that even if a country like Iran can work with China to such an extent and also develop its own sovereign industries that may potentially eventually compete with China, I don't think China is going to use military force against countries that it considers potential economic competitors. I think China wants to maximize win-win cooperation to the highest extent possible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you can make the argument that that's how things are now, but that's also again with implicit U.S. That's with U.S. being one of the polarities, right? And the EU. I guess in this hypothetical, if Japan was sort of not a part of that U.S. Polarity anymore, and sort of had to cling on to smaller allies, I still don't see. I guess you can make the argument that China would be more benevolent in that way, but and
Well, the
take more of a peaceful approach. But I guess if they wanted to, and if the ruling class wanted to sort of go after Japan for the past, I guess they could, and Japan can't really stop it.
well, to be fair, don't you think the U.S. could also do whatever it wants to Japan?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it could, but I guess there's different philosophies, right? And Japan also didn't subjugate America
Well, I know.
less than
I,
100
I
years ago.
think those specific philosophies, though, point to America being far more likely to do something like invade Japan. I mean, if there was a Japanese populist uprising that wanted to promote, reinvigorate the Japanese economy and industry, and come at that's going to challenge Western financial institutions that have propped up the Japanese economy in the latter part of World War II, I think America would put it on the table to do something like invade Japan. And the reason I think so is because, well, one, America, it bombed, it only used nuclear weapons once, which was against Japan for no reason other than to scare and intimidate the Soviet Union. I mean, it didn't need to do that, but it did. Um, it's like America has a kind of nihilistic and immoral philosophy of just very Machiavellian and very much. I mean, it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it dropped those bombs for absolutely no. It didn't do so because it needed to win the war. It didn't do so for any other reason than wanting to have a geopolitical intimidation of the Soviet Union. So hundreds of thousands of lives murdered, basically, for a very cynical purpose. And then, second of all, the U.S. has a history of invading countries that defy Western financial institutions and insist upon their own sovereignty in the past, and China doesn't. So I
I mean,
actually
I don't
think
disagree with you that the U.S. more likely would be the one to do that. But if there was some sort of a more populist uprising in Japan, but I guess in our hypothetical scenario, the U.S. would be collapsing in some sort of way, right? It's after the U.S. lost hegemony. In any meaningful way that I'm saying that China would sort of try to aggress on Japan. So we would. This is under the assumption that U.S. has sort of declined in the world stage. So yeah. So I guess you could still make the argument that even after the decline, if there was some sort of state in any formal way, I guess that whatever's left of the U.S. could still try to take over Japan. But I don't really. I think
I
they would
think
lose grip of
I
Japan
think
before that.
when it comes to matters like these, there's always going to be possibilities, right? In
Right.
order to cultivate, well, I think giving trust a chance should I mean, you can assume the worst about China's intentions and design. China's going to do the worst thing possible to Japan, right? That it can. But I think there does need to be a leap of trust. Now, Japan can try and give China a chance, basically. And if China transgresses in the way that you're describing, I'm sure that the Japanese people will not tolerate it, right?
Yeah, I
So
mean, I think there's already a mistrust of Japan. Just knowing Japanese people, there's already
right, but
an,
but you have to admit from a historical perspective. I mean, the only time China's invaded Japan was not under a Chinese or Han Chinese dynasty, but it was under the Yuan dynasty, and it's not because of Chinese aggression against Japan. It's the Mongols invaded everyone, right? They invaded China, they invaded
yeah.
Java. I mean, they invaded the world, right? So there was that yuan invasion of Japan. Beyond that, I don't think China's ever exhibited any aggression against Japan in history.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that it's irrational, but just knowing the sentiments of Japanese people, they already have a sort of a mistrust of Chinese people in general. That's what
I
I'm just saying, like the opinions that they have. So
Right,
I could, yeah, so I could see it getting ugly if there was any sort of
but I think this is also a misplaced hostility, because I think if the Japanese focused more on their internal antagonisms, I think that would take off a lot of the negative focus on China. I mean, you would agree that Japan is not in a very good state right now, right? I mean, Japanese industry is declining. The Japanese economy is stagnating. There's a demographic crisis. There's a spiritual crisis, a moral crisis, right? Kind of
yeah.
existential crisis of Japan. So I think entering into a new Asian era, right, would probably reinvigorate Japan um, as the only shot, basically, of preserving and reviving the Japanese civilization. I mean, it's under America's leadership, we see the kind of nihilism, the path Japan has gone down. It's in no way beneficial to the Japanese people.
No, I agree with you there. All I'm saying is that I could see the China, even if it wasn't militarily, I could see a Chinese puppet state. You know, a Chinese, like a pro-Chinese government in Japan. Like I could see that being a possibility if there was a real U.S. collapse, right?
Well,
Like a
a pro-Chinese government, which would be unpopular with the Japanese people.
yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I guess in a way, but it might be forceful, right? But if there's a ruling class that's pro-China, you know, I could see it being ugly. Again, I could see Japanese people being second-class citizens in that way if they really lost the ability to fight back in any meaningful way. Again, because militarily they have no chance.
Well, I
So
think any country that wants to be independent has to have the will to have confidence in itself, that it will defend itself and its own dignity. And again, I know you can't take my word for it that I don't believe China has these designs on Japan. But whether it's China or whether it's Timbuktu, right? Any country you want, right? Um, it's you can. I think there's one of the things I'm thinking of is that I think there's maybe this kind of over dependence Japan has on the US, where it no longer thinks it has to take sovereignty in its own hands, but rely on bigger powers in general, right? And it's a pattern you can kind of see in Japanese society as well. I mean, the birth rates are in decline. People don't want to get started families as much as they used to, and it's like something that permeates from. You can completely correct me if I'm wrong. This is just from what little I know about Japanese society. Is there's this kind of crisis of self determination and sovereignty in general, right? So dependence on America as a bigger power and an inability to return to Japanese sovereign power is a kind of existential crisis I think is facing Japan, because the most recent memory of Japanese sovereignty was during World War II, which led to the completely disastrous and catastrophic result. So, what I actually think is that, hypothetically and speculating, what I think is actually more likely is that China will be a new impetus and new possibility for Japan to reacquire its sense of sovereignty and sense of selfhood. It's not going to be dependent on China like it was dependent on America, because China doesn't want that. China doesn't want countries to be, you know, dependent on it and under its kind of coercion in the way that America has it, right? China wants countries to be able to take care of themselves. China can't. China struggles to govern itself, right? So it doesn't want to be governing all these other countries. I think China would prefer an independent Japanese government to govern the Japanese people. Um, and that's why I mentioned before that China is increasingly sympathetic to the pre World War II and pre 1930s kind of Japanese modernity, because it doesn't want Japan to become an imperialist power that invades other countries. But it also would probably prefer a Japan that is that is sovereign, right? That's not dependent on a bigger power at all. I think China and Japan can come to a point historically where they both respect each other and respect their independence.
Yeah, I mean that would be again, yeah, like you said, that would be best case scenario. But I think there's just an antagonism that maybe you might not be aware of. Just knowing Japanese people in general, they're just suspicious of Chinese people. Just
No,
you
I
could call it
understand that.
racist or yeah.
Yeah, but I think that if I were to talk to Japanese people telling me about this problem within their country, I think I would say focus on the issue of the contradiction of the Japanese establishment, right? Because right now Japan is not in a very good state, and I think if you focus people's attention against the status quo, you can put the question of Chinese relations on the back burner a little bit, right? Because I think Japan is facing bigger problems than that right now.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think realistically, this would be sort of deviating from the actual point. But yeah, realistically, the U.S. would probably be a bigger threat at this current moment if because there are, if you know anything about Japanese politics, there are conservative movements in Japan that are like real imperialistic. They're sort of like trying to bring back the old Japanese like energy and sort of politics and like denying any sort of atrocities that might have happened during World War II. There's like a real conservative movement in Japan that's sort of brewing. So sort of like how you see Trump, or well, some people will say like Trump, or like more radical right wingers. Like you're starting to see that in Japan in some sort of way. So my argument would be that yeah, I agree that America seems to be the bigger threat. Well, they are, right? The Japanese Constitution had literally been written by the U.S. So yeah, so I see that as a bigger issue, but all I'm saying is I think China, hopefully they would be more, they would take a more peaceful approach, but I'm saying that would just be off of just good faith. I don't see why materially they would do that.
Well, I think
They would have every reason
I,
to be
I think
vengeful.
we need to start shifting to a view about the new world order that's emerging, right? Where we kind of came from European modernity, which is this very cynical view of Hobbesian view that, if you can act like a pirate and a barbarian, you will. So it just gives rise to this cynicism where the default is like um barbarism towards your neighbors, right?
Yeah.
Um but if we actually study the history, let's just focus on Asia specifically for the past few thousand years, we can see that there were times where, I mean, hundreds of years could pass where all sorts of dynasties and governments could engage in aggression, but because of things like honor, right? Because of things like precedent and customs and traditions, they just consider it prohibited and not something. There were times where Chinese dynasties could have like developed um these specific gunpowder technologies, and they didn't because of the Confucian ethics. And these are not just like you know some kind of like completely miraculous good faith. I think things like honor, ethics, and so on, these are what define our humanity in the first place, right? So we should start looking at a post Hobbesian kind of view of international relations where we shouldn't assume that just because someone has an advantage of power that they're going to that it's a jungle, right? Where it's just going to be complete dog eat dog, and the bigger dog eats the small dog. Because believe it or not, that's not how human civilization has worked for the majority of the time that existed. I mean, there were a lot of instances of conquest and so on, but
Yeah, but it came out
honor,
of Europe mostly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
precisely, yeah, things
Yeah.
like honor, right? Things like tradition and precedent have had a very, very huge role in governing the interaction between civilizations before European modernity. And I think we're entering an era in which this is starting to become a factor again, right? It's not the only factor, but it is starting to become a working factor.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying there. Yeah, that is true. Maybe if China takes a more hands-off Eastern approach, maybe, but like I said, it doesn't have to necessarily be military force, but I could still see a pro-China sort of a quasi puppet state in Japan. Just being pro-China, right? Not necessarily that it's taken over by China, but just the government in the ruling class in Japan being pro-China, just because China has so much influence on that region. I could see that being an issue still, and I think that would antagonize the Japanese people in some sort of way. So I think that would be ugly regardless. I think either way, if the U.S. collapsed, things would change anyway. But I could still see China being a threat to Japan in some way. Maybe their way of living currently, which you can make an argument. Maybe it's a good thing. Um, but yeah, that would be I guess my last point there.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, that was pretty much it. I think we had a pretty reasonable conversation. I don't think we resolved anything, but you made some good points that I maybe should consider. Hopefully, I made good points.
Hmm.
I didn't really hear, haven't really heard. I've heard you guys talk about technocracy or just like a new sort of approach in any sort of way. So I think it was a good conversation.
So I don't mean I don't. Hopefully, you don't find this insulting, but there's some
Yeah.
people in my chat who are telling me I've debated you before. Is it true?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I don't know why they're saying that, but some people in my chat are saying like you were a libertarian before and I debated you or something.
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that, but.
Okay. Just
Yeah, I'm
asking. Yeah.
seeing Jason. I'm not sure who that is. But yeah.
I personally don't remember anything, but people are telling me that, so I just so
Okay.
sorry
Yeah,
about that.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I have a voice that sounds familiar to Jason or whatever. I don't know. But yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, thanks for the conversation, I guess.
All right. Thank you. See you.
All right. Yep. Bye.